From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today from Oklahoma State University, Derrell on the cattle markets. He'll talk about how the feeder cattle market is wrestling right now with high feed costs and stagnant fed cattle prices. Also, K-State's Sandy Johnson discusses a few reasons why you cow-calf producers might want to delay your spring breeding season. And she'll talk about managing the length of that season for cows and heifers, respectively. Further ahead, K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti on possible damage to that newly seeded corn from the sharp cold snap a couple of weeks back, what signs of that damage you growers should be looking for right now. And Jeff Wickman awaits with this week's forage segment. All that here on Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
This is the Monday edition of Agriculture Today. Thanks for being along with us. As always, the cattle markets are the first item of business today, and along with us via phone is livestock economist Derrell, Oklahoma State University, with quite an assortment of topics to get into this week, Derrell. But let's begin with the update on the market's very sluggish feeder cattle trade right now, isn't it?
Yeah, the markets are struggling right now. Feeder cattle markets in particular are really, kind of caught in a vice right now because we've got fed cattle markets pretty sluggish above them, not giving them any chance to follow them up. And at the same time, we've had this continued and even increased strength in feed grain prices, which obviously then is pressuring those feeder cattle markets. So both cash and futures markets, the cash auction prices, and the feeder futures have dropped significantly through the month of April as we head into May here.
As you view it, then, what's keeping the lid on the Fed trade? It's stuck in this very tight trading range and barely finding any room to the upside at all.
I really think the biggest problem on the fed cattle market is just a really effective cap on the slaughter capacity. It's becoming more apparent that that's an issue. We've sort of, estimated over the last several years that the situation for slaughter capacity had sort of flipped. We had excess capacity for 30 or 40 years. That changed in about 2016. And so in the current conditions, if you'll remember, February cattle on feed numbers were the highest of any month back to like 2000. And so we've got lots of cattle in the feedlot system, and the packing industry, I think, is making an attempt to try to move through those cattle. We've had very big Saturday kills, but there's just a limit on how fast they can move through those cattle. And
then in lockstep with that, as you note, slaughter weights are remaining on the high end. Are we looking at oversupply concerns then at some juncture, Derrell?
Well, interestingly enough, obviously, if you look at the box beef market, we've got tremendous strength there. So, I wouldn't suggest that the supply issues are weighing down on that market at this point in time. So, compared to what we might have expected just a few weeks ago, the carcass weights are staying up. Again, we've got strong slaughter rates, all things considered, and so we've got plenty of supply in one sense, and yet the demand seems to be there at the meat level to really support that market.
That has to continue. Otherwise, we might have an issue.
Well, yeah, that's right. Obviously it would be worse if we didn't have the demand to try to pull things through. And, again, we've had this remarkably strong box beef market. Packers clearly have tremendous margins right now, which, again, I think they are attempting to respond to. Saturday kills, as I mentioned, are large. They're almost double what they were in, say, 2019 through the first part of the year up to this point in time. And so we've got a little bit of a situation here where we've got the meat side pulling one way and an effective capacity constraint that's kind of holding us back otherwise.
while on demand, you put together some notes on where we are with U.S. beef exports after the first 2 months of this calendar year 2021. There's been an improvement, you say, recently after a rather lethargic start to the year?
Well, obviously our trade data comes in with a couple of months delay, so we're always lagging just a little bit. And that may be part of what's driving some of the current strength we're seeing, for example, in boxed beef prices. But, yes, we started a little bit slower on beef exports at the beginning of the year. Now, if you look at like China, Hong Kong, which increasingly I put those data together instead of looking at them separately, and they're still showing a continuation of the kind of strength that we saw last year, but it was a little bit sluggish in some of our other major markets, Japan and South Korea and Mexico.
You talk about some traditional customers of U.S. beef, Japan in particular. The first 2 months of this year, exports were down to that country over 11%, while South Korea, they actually are ahead of Japan as a beef export market so far this year. You might talk specifically about those.
In the last really 3 or more years, South Korea has been a rapidly growing market. Even going back to the really high prices and as far back as 2015 and 2016, South Korea was a rapidly growing market. So they've closed the gap on Japan as the number 2 market, and on a monthly basis have exceeded Japan, as you note. And so, again, they've been a very rapidly growing market for us. And, of course, one of the things to keep in mind, whether we're talking Japan or South Korea or China, Hong Kong, or any of these markets, is they tend to be markets for a fairly specific set of products in each case. It's different across different markets. Certainly that's true when you compare the Asian markets to the Latin American markets. And so you have to sort that out in terms of really understanding the net impact. But the bottom line is, in terms of total volume, South Korea is emerging as one of our really strong and consistently strong markets for the most part.
Once more, as you say, the eye catcher here, China, Hong Kong, looking at those in combination, up 115% year over year during the first 2 months of 2021. Can that be sustained? That's the million-dollar question, Derrell.
Well, it certainly is a question. I mean, obviously, anytime we're talking international markets, there's a lot of potential volatility in those markets. But what emerged in 2020 was a rapid expansion of growth in the data specifically for mainland China. But, of course, after the change a number of years ago, China and Hong Kong really are not separate anymore. And as we anticipated, when you grow exports officially to China, you may see some decrease in exports to Hong Kong because there was always a certain level of transshipment between those two markets. And so putting the two together really nets that out. And what we see is the growth is there. There's every indication that it will continue strong for China. Their overall imports, of course, they've emerged as a very strong leading global importer of beef in recent years. Part of that is related to the protein deficit from African swine fever affecting their pork production. But beyond that, it's due to a fundamental growth in demand for beef in China.
Something else that you recently wrote on, and we want to include this in our conversation today. You're encouraging producers, particularly in the western part of the U.S., to put together a forage plan for the coming year. And this stems from dry weather to flat-out drought over a wide swath of the western half of this country. Derrell, you might talk about that.
You bet. And in fact, from the time I wrote that article you're referring to was a couple of weeks ago, and it's just continued to get worse, bearing out the concerns that I had in that article. Drought conditions have continued to advance on a national basis, if you will, in those areas where it is, and it's expanding in some areas. And the thing is, at this time of the year, every day, every week that the drought persists in those areas is cutting into now our growing season. And so it's going to be taking a noticeable bite out of our forage potential, if you will, both pasture and hay production for the year. And if we lose, May and June in particular, that takes a serious hunk out of our total forage availability really for the next year. It'll be this time next year before we have another shot at a growing season. So for that reason, I encourage producers to really look carefully at where they are right now in terms of any reserves they might have, what their local situation is in terms of potential for producing forage and really make a plan that covers most of the next year, not just the next month, because I think our situation right now really is going to shape the outcomes really for much of the rest of the year and perhaps all the way through the winter until this time next year.
And you note in that article that our neighboring state to the west, Colorado, actually saw a 14.5% decrease in its cow inventories last year, herd liquidation. Likely we'll see more of that in other pockets of the region, Derrell?
I think so. And in fact, the weekly slaughter data for beef cows would suggest it's increased in the last couple of weeks of data that we have. I think we're beginning to see that. It'll take a little time to really sort of isolate exactly where that's happening, but anecdotally, we're hearing stories already out of places like North Dakota that we're beginning to see some movement of cattle. So, again, we're at a really critical time in terms of not only the individuals directly involved in these situations and places where the drought could advance, but also, generally from a broader market perspective, we may see some overall price impacts. And depending on what happens with the cow herd, it may change the trajectory of the whole industry as we go forward in terms of where we are from a cattle inventory or a cow inventory standpoint by the time we get to the end of the year.
Well, lastly, how you see the markets trending this upcoming trading week. Will the fed cattle market show any signs of life, so to speak?
I think we've got some real pressure right now that's going to take a little bit more time to work out. Again, we've just got, kind of burdensome fed cattle supplies. I think we will work through that, and I think there's, a few weeks down the road, there's potential for some of the optimism that we've had to really express itself. But we've got a little more challenges, and obviously we're watching this feed market very close in terms of what happens to it in the next few weeks as well, and the impacts that has, more so maybe on the feeder cattle market, but both the feeder and fed markets will, I think they're going to continue struggling a little bit with some of the current challenges we have before they have much of a chance to improve overall.
Always appreciate your input, Derrell. We'll touch base in a few weeks once more. Many thanks to you.
You're welcome. Anytime.
He joins us regularly to talk the cattle market trends. Derrell Peel, livestock economist, Oklahoma State University. And you're listening to Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today. And now we'll talk about what is definitely the next crucial phase of cow-calf management for those who are running a spring breeding program. In fact, spring breeding time is nigh. Before you producers get too far into that, though, some thoughts on management that are pertinent to our conditions at hand out there right now. Sandy Johnson joins us once more. She's a beef reproduction specialist with K-State Research and Extension. You've a couple of questions in mind here as far as the breeding season, where to start and how long, and there are some complicating factors perhaps this year, you say, Sandy.
Right. As we think about that decision of when to start breeding or when to calving, it's really a complex discussion, but I want to just hit on a few points for this year. One is if you were calving during that extreme cold in February and lack the resources to manage through that weather as well as you'd like, certainly I think there's people thinking about that timing of calving, but we know that there'll be weather stressors again, and I think a person has to recognize that and evaluate. For some people, it's no longer as easy as it was to haul those calves inside. And, is this still working for your operation? So I just encourage you to think about that in the bigger picture. And my guess is that many people have been thinking about that. And then the second item, more in a shorter term view. So we've got this general time we start our breeding season, but there are times when we might want to think about delaying that a little bit. And that might be if we ask ourselves, are our cows ready to breed? Have we seen evidence that they've started cycling? Are they in adequate body condition? from the standpoint of managing this, if your cows aren't ready to breed, let's make sure and start prior to weaning time this fall to help correct that. But for right now, what we do is try and estimate, are they cycling? And if you're breeding about this time of year, or starting to, we have this winter coat that's shedding off, and you see one or two cows in heat, and essentially that hair gets rubbed off, and you have your own heat detection aid right there to plain evidence that some of those cows have been in heat. So if you're not seeing any of that whatsoever, that's a message to you. And from our research with ester synchronization, we found that roughly 50% of the cows are cycling in some of our commercial type herds in Kansas. And so if 50% are cycling at the start of the breeding season, in a situation where 100% of the cows were cycling, we should see 5% of those in heat every day. So 5 out of 100 should be in heat every day. If half of them are cycling, so maybe 2 to 3 per day out of 100. And of course, cyclicity is coming on quickly this time of year. But if you haven't seen anything in the last 2 weeks and you're going to turn bulls out tomorrow, let's think about this.
And wait.
Right, and wait a week. And I can expand on that more, but the second part of that is the cows need to be ready, but the grass also needs to be ready. And right now in northwest Kansas, we're behind. It's been cool plus dry, and we want to be cautious about turning cows out that have been, maybe they've been in the pens receiving a very good diet, turn them out and you really have dropped their nutrition from the dry lot situation to grazing, and those cows that are getting close to cycling may be delayed. Now, some may argue, well, why not go ahead and turn the bulls out? The early ones will get bred. Well, that's true, but here's the other side of that story. If you go ahead and turn those bulls out and, a few of those cows may be cycling, you might get 1 or 2 calves that turn out to be a few weeks older than the rest of them. We know that the calving time next year, it's those older calves that shed pathogens that make those younger calves sick. So here you're setting up the majority of your early-born calves to get sick from what's shed from those 1 or 2 early calves. And the other thing that happens is we spread out those cows in a long calving or breeding season is that it's harder to manage that nutrition. 60 days is nice. You go to 120 days, you're always over or under feeding one group of cows. And neither of those things are efficient. And the same type of thought then can come with timing of vaccinations. We look at when we want to vaccinate calves prior to going out on grass, or maybe we're giving a pre-calving scours vaccination that we want to hit so many days prior to calving. You're never hitting any of those things right when you're really strung out there. So, yeah, you can turn the bulls out, but think about trying to keep them more condensed. And as that grass comes down, they'll surely start cycling sooner, but if it's a little slow, might be just as well wait a little bit.
Multiple things going on here. Circling back then to what you said, for these reasons, one might want to put off breeding for a week or some reasonable period of time related to that?
Yeah, and, I use that week as kind of a ballpark figure depending on what those conditions are. But, particularly in really dry years, and sometimes we're expecting the grass to come on and it doesn't, and we've already turned out and we're already in that position. Just recognize that we've got to get good nutrition in those cows to keep them cycling. And if the reality is it doesn't happen, then we may need to think about other adjustments to the breeding season.
The other side of this that you brought up at the outset, Sandy, is managing the length of the breeding season itself. And we often talk about the luxury, if you will, of a condensed calving season. Well, those two relate, don't they?
Right. In an ideal world, we'd have a very condensed calving season that would also make those calves more uniform at the time we go to marketing. So we're reducing that age variation. And from a cow perspective, all the things we talked about on management with that few early calves and a bunch later, those are reasons why we don't want to spread those cows out. And if we look at heifers, I think there's really, really good data to support the importance or the value, I guess, of a short breeding season, because those late bred heifers are just at high risk at failure to rebreed. And why do we want to set ourselves up for that problem, particularly if we're already seeing a low rebreeding rate in those young cows? Let's help ourselves by keeping that short breeding season on the heifers. And that may mean that you need to turn out a few more females than you might usually with a longer breeding season. But the hope would be that you can make those yearling heifers that are either late bred or open also a profitable enterprise. You don't have to keep them in your own herd. And so I think those are things to think about as we're thinking about the length of the breeding season. And I certainly want to recognize that a bred cow is going to sell for more than an open calf. We've got to market some. But you don't have to keep a late bred cow. You can look for opportunities to market and look at the reasons why your herd has got this spread out calving season.
But as far as an actual defined number of days that would be a standard breeding season target, is there any such thing, or must this flex with each operation?
Well, I think that there's certainly a lot of variability out there, and to say there's one magic thing, but for producers that start their breeding season with estrus synchronization, they can easily maintain a pregnancy rate equal to a longer breeding season and still be within this, say, 50-day period, unless some unexpected thing comes along, like the grass not coming on, or, we didn't quite have the forage quality we thought. So one needs to be sensitive to those things and your type of management and how closely you can watch those cows. And you can leave the bull out as long as you want, in my book, as long as you preg check in a timely manner. And, your veterinarian is going to be your partner in doing that. So visit with your veterinarian about options to stage those pregnancies. And I think there's a lot more value in knowing the timing of those pregnancies than people typically think of. And so we have the technology, and that information can be very valuable.
Main message here you're sharing with cow-calf operators out there, though, just don't blindly turn out on this established date. Think through first all of these variables beforehand and make a prudent decision on that.
Right. Are the cows ready? Is the grass ready? Does everything look normal that we can turn out on our normal date? And a little bit of adjustment is okay.
And we might note that in a forthcoming Beef Tips newsletter out of K-State, Sandy will have a write-up on this very thing. So be watching for that at ksubeef.org. But once more, pre-breeding season thoughts for you producers to contemplate. And Sandy, timely that you share all of these with us. Thanks for joining us as always. We'll talk again soon.
Glad to be here.
Beef reproduction specialist Sandy Johnson, K-State Research and Extension, joining us from her office in Colby, Northwest Kansas, on this Agriculture Today. We'll be back after the break. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate. Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
You're tuned into Agriculture Today, and glad to have you back. Again, we're referencing those colder temperatures that settled in during the week of April the 19th, really the 20th through the 22nd. You'll recall here just a couple of weeks back now just how dastardly cold it got around Kansas. And at that point, there was a fair amount of corn that had already been seeded. And that then raised the question, did that corn suffer any ill effects of the cold weather? Well, we're asking that question of our guest now via phone, Ignacio Ciampitti, crop production and cropping systems specialist, K-State Research and Extension. So how about it, Ignacio? How vulnerable was that early planted corn to those freezing temperatures?
Yeah, as always, Eric, thanks for the invitation. And then we always start this idea of discussing the optimal temperature, and we will always say that in many situations when we are selecting the optimal planting date, looking at the forecast and trying to understand what the weather might do in the next coming days is a critical factor for taking that decision. So if you look at the temperatures that we have, the soils were in a better shape in terms of, moisture content. Some of the areas in central, eastern part of the states were okay. So although in many situations we have seen a very slow warming up, specifically due to some of the good soil moisture conditions. In March, we are seeing that in April we were on the cooler side. Temperatures in many situations are ranging from, in the soil, 2 inches, they were ranging from 42 Fahrenheit in northwest Kansas to really 55 in southeast. And that's the magnitude of variability that we have in that soil temperature. Even within a few situations, for example, one of the cases in southeast, that soil temperature ranges from around 40s to close to 60s, almost within the same week at 4 inches. So that gives us an idea of how large and broad could be the variation in soil temperature. And then when you start thinking about, okay, but what is the potential impact soil temperature on corn emergence? Well, one of the main things that we need to identify or start the discussion is that we know that cold temperatures really can result in potential injury for germination.
That's called chilling injury. Is that correct, Ignacio?
Yeah, exactly. And that is usually happening when we are at temperatures that they are below 50 degrees. And we are saying that usually that is when we start seeing some damaging. When we start looking at when exactly, because it's not about only the temperature, but it's the combination of the planting time. The first 24 to 72 hours after planting are critical. So when a farmer is planting the crop, anything that got planted before the cold temperature, we are putting that seed in the process that if temperatures drop extremely fast in the next 24 or 72 hours during that window, we might see that potentially damage on that germination process. And usually what happens is that the cell tissues of the kernel of the seed, if they are too cold, they become less elastic. And then when that water is coming, we start producing what we call the leaky cells. That basically that seed start rupture during the swelling process. And then we start seeing that in many symptoms of the injury could include like swollen kernels, they never germinate. Or sometimes we are seeing in many situations, seed that they start to germinating, but the coleoptile is not correct or is screw or has a deformation. We are seeing also abortion of the growth of even of the roots of the radicle. So we start seeing some potential issues that in many situations it can, at the end of the day, it can basically produce some stunting or death. This idea of deformation, in many places, if the corn was already up, let's say that the farmer was planting first week of April or before, if that corn was already up, we might see, and we have a picture on the article, that leaf burn, which is nothing to be that concerned, because in many situations when this happens, when the corn is when the corn has thigh leaf stage, the initial corn, the growing point is below the ground. So in those situations when this growing point is below the ground, there is not really an effect of that really low temperature on that growing point. So we might see that leaf burn, but in many situations we might potentially see recovery of that plant. So for any farmers that are making any decisions, our recommendation would be, usually we say 4 to 7 days after that basically cold stress, a really good opportunity for them to go out and start scouting the fields and looking at the potential damage. So far, based on some of the things that we have seen, we are not seeing exactly that much of an issue, to be honest.
How much damage, though, would indicate that replanting that corn would be necessary? That's a very difficult thing to pin down, isn't it, Ignacio?
Yes. It's not easy to pin down, and in many situations, again, we need to wait at least 7 days if we are only looking at the leaf run, because in many situations the decision will come once temperatures are going up, as we are seeing, for example, these days, and we see new tissue, new leaves. As soon as we see those new leaves, we know that that corn will recover with no problem. In some of the other cases, for those that they were planting last week, in that case specifically, we really need to wait to see how the plants are coming up, and then most likely if we start seeing plants that are not coming up, digging and looking at what are the potential conditions for why those plants are not coming up. But everything will be defined, I would say, in the next few days, because at this time of the year, if we have good temperature and moisture, so we can see that corn coming up probably in less than 2 weeks.
Very good. Well, as you referred, there is an article in the E-Update newsletter. This one was posted Thursday, April the 22nd, and it gets into potential chilling injury to corn seed in the ground and the ensuing impacts on germination and emergence. Take a look at that. It's at agronomy.ksu.edu. Thanks for covering this in brief with us, Ignacio, and now that we're well into the planting season, we'll be touching base with you from time to time and see what's happening with these new crops. Appreciate your time right here.
Thank you very much, Eric, for the invitation, as always.
He's Ignacio Ciampitti, K-State Research and Extension Crop Production Specialist, here on this segment of Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. Kansas 4-H has a new communications project that utilizes a series of lesson plans to engage 4-H youth in hands-on learning to strengthen their communication skills. Kansas 4-H Youth Development Specialist for the Northeast region, Diane Mack, says the trained club volunteers are being used to enhance the cornerstone of 4-H, teaching youth how to communicate. Diane, a project that really kind of stemmed from changes we had to make during COVID-19 in terms of finding out how we can get more material and more information into the hands of youth and also the youth leaders. And part of that involved what is known as the Communications Project.
Yeah, so we asked club leaders, what is it they needed during these times? And some of the response was hands-on learning activities that can be taught in like 15 to 20 minutes at that club level. We know that some clubs are meeting virtually, some are meeting face-to-face, but this just helped to meet that need that they were asking for. Extension agents at the local level recruited 98 project leaders that said, yes, I want to be involved in this project. That was from about 32 extension units across the state. And so what we asked them was to use National 4-H Council's 4-H communications curriculum to conduct 6 lesson plans over the 4-H year. So we actually started in October. We trained these 98 project leaders, and then they would teach the lessons, and then we'd come back and touch base with them and then help them work through a couple more. So right now, they should have done most of them. And, with the way schedules are, there's probably still a few that still have some of the lesson plans to do. But we'll check in with them again in May to see how things are going.
The first one was communication, and what things were covered during that?
Well, that one, basically the outcome was to be aware of their own communication preferences, kind of introduce verbal and nonverbal message, and then really thinking about active listening. And then what we moved into was some writing, how important it is to still think about writing some letters and notes. And we all know how important that came to be during COVID when we couldn't see one another. People really appreciated some handwritten notes. And then we got into what we traditionally call what 4-H teaches, is being able to get up and give a public presentation, whether that be an illustrated talk or a demonstration. And so what the young person then learned during that was to, be organized and then practice giving a presentation.
Another communications project was called Follow My Lead. What did they do with that?
Well, that specifically talked about how you can be concise and how people interpret the instructions you're giving. And so sometimes we think we're being, fairly descriptive on what we want happening. And through the activity that was in the book, I think it was actually making like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But how do you tell people to take out 2 pieces of bread and, use your knife and those types of things? So it really was about how clear your communication can be and that people interpret what you're saying to follow directions.
They also talked about jumping in. I can kind of think where this might be headed, but explain it in detail.
So jumping in was basically understanding your own and others' communication mode preferences from various cultures, basically communicating cultural understanding. And then Follow My Lead was how to give clear objectives. And then Let's Write was understanding the difference between letter writing formats and how to choose those appropriately.
Another was illustrated talks, and that probably had a lot of hands-on as well.
Right. This one, when they really think about writing a presentation, it talks about organizing. And so, what's that title? What are they going to start with the introduction by grabbing the attention of their audience and then writing that body of the speech to organize and explain the steps, then to end with that conclusion and summary so that they repeat the main points that the audience should remember. And then the other thing was, so what visuals or props do I need to help communicate the message I'm trying to share as well?
And the final project for the communications project was Doable Demo. I'm assuming that included some sort of a demonstration.
Correct. So those same steps for an illustrated talk, basically when you do a demonstration, you're actually having the thing there and demonstrate as you go along with those steps as well.
This is something that really ties in with the overall theme for 4-H communications, one of the cornerstones, and this really seems to feed into that. And the fact that they were able to kind of pare this down to maybe a 15-minute presentation is kind of amazing, actually.
Again, back to what the club leaders were asking, and then, they helped to recruit these volunteers to actually lead these. It just gave that other opportunity. We usually say that during the 4-H experience that young people will be able to get up and give a presentation in an organized manner. And so this was just a teachable way that there, was curriculum that they could use, and there were 6 lesson plans to go over during the different meetings. And then hopefully they will give a presentation, whether they did that, what we call 4-H Day, which usually happens in February and March, when they can decide what is the topic I want to talk about. Or at county fair time, there's also time perhaps that their county fair allows them to give up and get a presentation. So, you have this 6 lesson plans and working on these things and thinking about communication, thinking about active listening, responding to the audience, getting their attention, and then actually, giving that presentation in front of a group, in front of a person to evaluate them and learn from that process as well.
Kind of nice that they're able to do this as a club activity, because it's probably a little bit easier if you haven't been doing a lot of this kind of public speaking to do it in front of your friends.
Correct. One of the safe places, that being able to share with those club members that and maybe they've been doing it virtually. Maybe they learned, to make a PowerPoint, versus what we think about giving it in person, which some people do use PowerPoint there as well. So again, it's changing those skills to adapt to whatever setting they have and providing that safe space, as you say, giving it in front of their friends. Because usually part of the presentation is, are there any questions? And so then, they can ask each other about whatever that project is or that they decided to give the topic on. And one of the things we really stress to young people is start with something that you really have an interest in and that you know something about, so that you can share that with others versus trying to just maybe pick up a topic that you don't know anything about. So that's a piece of learning this as well. We've checked in with the leaders a couple of times, and one thing that they did tell us was that they have recruited an older 4-H member to help as well, because the kids react to them really well and they want to be learning the leadership skills. And so, again, they've been able to take on this communication role and help with presenting the information and then helping facilitate that as well.
And I think if they want, they can actually go see a couple of these webinars on the 4-H website.
Correct. Some people weren't able to connect with us during the presentation time, so we added those to the Kansas 4-H website, and so they're available. If you go to the project areas and then communications, you'll find them there.
That's Diane Mack, the Kansas 4-H Youth Development Specialist for the Northeast region. To learn more about the Communications Project or to watch the recorded webinars, go to kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.